time on the hit list, we catch up on what some of rock and roll's great legends are up to now. Back in 1967, when a 25-year-old Paul McCartney sang about losing his hair and renting a cottage on the Isle of Wight in When I'm 64, he could have had no idea that the song would come back to haunt him nearly 40 years later, having become the most successful composer and musician in the history of popular music. After breaking every sales record in the book during his tenure with the Beatles in the 60s, his first solo album, McCartney, became a #1 hit and spawned the ballad Maybe I'm Amazed. Since then, his catalogue of albums, which includes several releases with his 70s band Wings, has been met with varied reception from critics and audiences. Some of his major hits have included Mull of Kintyre, Coming Up, With a Little Luck and Silly Love Songs. In more recent years, his phenomenal musical output, which has included writing orchestral music, has been largely overshadowed by events in his private life. In 1998, the British public joined him in mourning the death of his wife of nearly 30 years. Linda McCartney had become a household name in her own right for her success as a photographer and her commitment to animal activism. Less than 2 years later, his fans were stunned to see him flaunting his new relationship with anti-landmine campaigner Heather Mills, whom he married in 2002. Their acrimonious split 4 years later sparked an even greater media feeding frenzy. But throughout it all, Paul kept pumping out the music.
To just have nothing, be sitting here, pick up your guitar, and then after an hour or two, you've got a song. And some people, if it works, are gonna go, I love that one, or whatever, you know. And it's like, wow, yes, it's like baking a great cake or something.
Ironically, while the press and British public were wrapped up in the minutiae of his private life, Paul had been getting down to the business of creating another album with the help of producer Nigel Godrich, famous for his work with Radiohead and Beck.
I think for Paul, I think he deserves some respect that maybe he hasn't got in recent history, and I would like to see him have that.
Chaos and Creation in the Backyard ended up being pronounced Paul's best album since leaving the Beatles. The following year, his devoted fans queued up overnight to meet their hero and score signed copies of his latest classic release, Ecce Cor Meum, and a new live concert DVD.
We queued last night at 5:30 and slept out at Piccadilly Circus overnight and get to meet Paul today, and it's totally worth it. It's a little chilly, but it's totally worth it.
And as far as Paul is concerned, he'll keep going until he's 94.
I'll do it as long as they like it and I like it.
In April 2009, at the age of 68, Bob Dylan became the oldest artist ever to have an album debut at #1 on the Billboard 200 charts. His 33rd album, Together Through Life, also broke the record for the longest gap between solo #1s in the UK. The last time Bob had topped the charts there was back in 1970 with New Morning. The legendary songwriter, poet and painter's love of performing is completely at odds with his obsession with privacy off stage, which has added to the mystique of the barrier-breaking icon who started off singing folk and blues protest songs in New York's Greenwich Village in the early 60s. The political and social content of his songs and disregard for authority earned him his status as a modern-day prophet, and songs like Blowin' in the Wind, The Times They Are A-Changing and A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall have become anthems. In 2005, Martin Scorsese attempted to capture the many sides of a man who won a Pulitzer Prize for his profound effect on popular music and American culture in a documentary.
Learning about Dylan is the constant recreating of himself, but always staying in line with the original inspiration to say something, has something to say, whether it's about a psychological or emotional state or it's about politics or whatever. And I think it's important in our society today for young people who are becoming artists, or budding artists, I should say, to remember it's more important if you have something to say than to make a lot of money.
At the premiere of No Direction Home Bob Dylan, fellow film director Jim Jarmusch offered up his tribute.
No, I met him briefly a few times. I'm just a big fan of one of the greatest visionary songwriters of the last 50 years. So he's just someone in music history that's so valuable. He loves the form so deeply of songwriting. I just kind of wish they could take that myth off of him and all that weight off of him and just let him be a traveling troubadour, musician, giving us these beautiful songs.
Coming in at number 2 behind the Beatles on Rolling Stone's list of the Immortals, the 100 greatest artists of all time, the man himself remains an enigma due to his reluctance to talk about himself in interviews. But that doesn't stop his peers and fans from trying to define his place in history.
Just his uniqueness, you know, is obviously his lyrics, and the fact that he's still playing it every day for 300 days a year. He's kind of like a genius gypsy, you know? That's what it is.
Yes, he affected the rock and roll business a little bit by completely changing it.
Often referred to as the godmother of punk, Patti Smith isn't so fond of the label.
Every time you see a journalist that calls me a punk rocker, it's because they don't have the imagination or the professional intelligence or curiosity to see the full breadth of what I've done and what my band has done. So it's really just lazy journalism.
The daughter of a jazz-singing Jehovah's Witness, she was born in Chicago in 1946 and in the late 60s moved to New York, where she frequented fashionable nightclubs and befriended musicians and photographers such as Robert Mapplethorpe. She formed the Patti Smith Group and built a cult following through performances at the legendary New York punk rock club CBGB's. Her debut album, Horses, released in 1975, subsequently inspired many big names in rock and remains at number 44 on Rolling Stone's list of the greatest albums of all time. Over the decades, she's collaborated with the likes of Bruce Springsteen and Michael Stipe, covered songs by Kurt Cobain, the Rolling Stones and Prince, exhibited her own paintings, delivered literary lectures, and been named a Commander of the Order of Arts and Letters by the French Ministry of Culture. Trying to capture it all in a movie was a challenge that filmmaker Steven Sebring had to say yes to.
I mean, she does so many things. I mean, how could you not, you know? I always think of this movie as like a fine wine, you know? And we had no design. You know, I didn't have a design. She didn't hire me to film her. It just sort of happened naturally.
After working with Steven for 12 years, Patti was determined to see Renaissance Woman as much more than a documentary.
One of the reasons I like working with Steven is he wasn't interested in doing a so-called rock documentary. He was interested because I paint, I take photographs, politically active, I'm a mother, and he was interested in everything that I do, and so that rock and roll, although is quite important, is in its place in accordance with my life. And I was very pleased with that, because I would like, you know, if one is going to be perceived publicly, I would be happier being perceived as more well-rounded and not concentrated in one area.
And those fans hoping to get a chronological account of Patti's life and career had better look elsewhere.
Time, you know, we don't live such linear lives. You know, we're always accessing the past and hoping for the future. And so the movie, without being too confusing, I believe has a sense of past, present, and future happening almost simultaneously, because that's how we are as human beings. We carry our whole life with us.
New Jersey's favourite son, Bruce Springsteen, supposedly got stuck with his nickname The Boss while still a teenager in the 60s. The story goes that he acquired it by taking it upon himself to collect his band's nightly pay from clubs and distribute it to the other musicians. Despite allegedly hating the nickname, he was obviously still calling the shots 40 years later, as he and the E Street Band prepared for their 2009 world tour.
Usually we'll play a little longer in the States before we go to Europe, but this time, as far as who decides the songs, well, the boss decides. The boss decides what we play. Nobody else decides. People suggest, hint, beg, cajole, but I decide.
The E Street Band, which has backed Bruce since 1972, may have seen a few lineup changes over the years, but still contains original members Clarence Clements and Gary Talent, as well as his longtime collaborator and friend, guitarist Stephen Van Sant.
We stayed together, you know. We stayed alive. That's hard to do for people in our business. It's true, you know. And also, you know, imagine you're working alongside of the same people you were with in high school, you know, for 40 years or so, and keeping that together. So all of those things are nice, and they're sort of, they just kind of come up as they do. But in the end, it's you know, it's corny, but it's the long ride that it's all about.
The Long, Long Ride has included releasing 8 Billboard 200 #1 albums, the most famous of which was Bruce's 1984 smash Born in the USA, which sold 15 million copies to become one of the biggest-selling albums of all time. It also spawned 7 top 10 singles and was followed by a sellout world tour. The album's title track, which was in fact a criticism of the US government's treatment of Vietnam veterans, was misconstrued as jingoistic by some politicians and corporations. But his famously blue-collar views have led to strong associations with the Democrat Party, and he was invited to play at Barack Obama's inauguration concert. He also recently won a Golden Globe Award for his song The Wrestler, which featured in the 2007 film of the same name starring Mickey Rourke. And before heading out on tour in 2009, he and the band warmed up with a little halftime gig at the Super Bowl.
I think that really why we said yes this year, they asked us many times, and was because, one, we have a new album coming out, dummy. Come on, there's a new record in the stores, you know. So it just happened to come out this past week. So we have our mercenary reasons, of course, you know, and besides our deep love of football.
Chrissie Hynde, originally from Akron, Ohio, spent most of the 70s desperately trying to get a band together in London. After short stints in interestingly named outfits like Masters of the Backside and the Moors Murderers, she finally scored a manager in 1978, who helped her put together the original lineup of The Pretenders, with Pete Farndon on bass and James Honeyman Scott on guitar. 30 years later, she faced the unenviable task of compiling a box set of her favorites called Pirate Radio.
You know, the Pretenders really has been a rock band, and I think the stuff that has been on the radio has been the more poppy, you know, mid-tempo stuff, which is nice too, but, you know, I wanted to represent us for what, you know, the spirit of the band, which was more rock.
Although the band has kept the same name for 3 decades, the Pretenders have seen numerous lineup changes, largely due to the tragic deaths of both Pete and James through drugs overdoses.
No, I never thought the Pretenders could exist outside of me and Pete and Jimmy and Martin, the original Pretenders. If one of us left the band, I thought we'd have to change the name and start all over. And then when Pete and Jimmy both OD'd on drugs within the space of a year of each other, and, you know, it got all, you know, a lot of events which we hadn't anticipated came very quickly, and well, how can I say this without sounding really crap? But yeah, I really kept the thing going as a tribute to the band, and also I was, you know, I think in retrospect quite traumatized by the way things had gone.
Turning the trauma into inspiration, Chrissie went on to write and record a catalogue of rock and pop classics, such as Hymn to Her, Don't Get Me Wrong, Back on the Chain Gang, and I'll Stand By You. Alongside her musical career, which has included collaborations with other artists and contributing to soundtracks, Chrissy has also become an avid animal rights activist and regularly turns out in support of anti-cruelty campaign organisation PETA. However, when it's time to strap on that Fender Telecaster, all she wants to do is rock.
I'm not trying to say anything. You really play guitar in a rock band because it's more fun than being a waitress. That's all it was for me. I don't think I broke any ground or did anything different. Well, I know I haven't.
Throughout his many splendid 40-year career, David Bowie has succeeded where almost every other enduring popular artist has failed. Continually courageous in his avant-garde style choices, he's kept a miraculously clean sheet of fashion faux pas. He released his first solo album in 1967, but it wasn't until 2 years later that he got his commercial breakthrough with the single Space Oddity. 4 decades and 25 albums later, he's amassed a fortune of around £100 million.
It's a struggle to understand how I'm no longer 20. I don't know anybody else this has ever happened to. Most people, they get to 20, and then they stay 20. It didn't happen for me, though. I just went on and on and on, and suddenly I'm 56.
In 1972, he burst out of another chrysalis as the androgynous extraterrestrial Ziggy Stardust. Audiences were said to have found his live shows so exhilarating that people were having sex in the aisles. He certainly wasn't thinking about the future.
It didn't occur to me that, rock and roll ever had a life that long, Well, nobody at that particular time really thought it would become something. Myself and my contemporaries of my age, I guess it's all new ground to us, We're just learning what to do with it at this age and still playing rock and roll. Because we're the first bunch that have gotten that far along,
Into the 80s, he introduced himself to a whole new generation as a suave lounge lizard and scored his biggest commercial success ever with the album Let's Dance. It spawned 4 hits: Ashes to Ashes, Let's Dance, Modern Love and China Girl, confirming his status as a transgenerational sex god. At the end of the decade, he formed the hard rock quartet Tin Machine. They released 2 studio albums and a live record. The band received mixed reviews and a somewhat lukewarm reception. But then David Bowie's continual reinvention has never had a commercial incentive.
It's for selfish reasons as much as anything else. It's to keep us interested, Because I think if the artist's interest goes, it plays to the audience that way, and you don't want to go and see an artist who looks bored stiff with what he's doing.
Now in his 60s, he's still a workaholic, but his early hedonistic outlook has matured.
It's rather disturbing because when you're young, you think so much is important, including oneself. But as you get older, I think you find less and less is important, apart from some very fundamental things. One of them being a love of one's fellow man, and a care for their survival, and a care for one's immediate family, then friends, and then wider, like a circle, like ripples in water.
New wave band Blondie came by their first commercial success by accident in 1977, when an Australian music television show played the B-side of their single Ex-Offender by mistake. In the Flesh became a hit, and the band's lead singer Debbie Harry went on to front a barrel of eclectic hits, including Denis, Heart of Glass, One Way or Another, Call Me and Rapture. Debbie's wide-jawed beauty, trademark dyed blonde hair and trashy style immediately captured the imagination of music journalists, photographers and fans. Her identity began eclipsing that of the band and led to ructions within the group. After several splits and shake-ups, only 4 of the band's original members remain. In 2006, when all 7 original members of Blondie were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, former member Frank Infanti begged to perform with the current lineup, but was rebuffed by the famously feisty frontwoman.
If it hadn't been for the fact that they had, all 3 of those guys sued us at various times for different things, which I think was really intolerable. It's much better to pick up the phone and talk to somebody than to take them to court. And so, you know, I don't know. There's just a limit, you know. I think that really set the limit for me.
At the age of 60, she was proud to have been one of the first white female musicians to rap lyrics on their 1981 hit, Rapture.
I don't think I'm really a rapper, but I think it was an homage to rap and to a form of music that we found very exciting and really interesting. And I don't know, to me it was like folk music for black kids. You know, it's like the 60s had a folk music for white kids, you know, it was all sort of traditional. But I think that in terms of the voice of the people, just getting up and saying what's on their mind, you know, I really always sort of equated those two things.
Like Patti Smith and the Ramones, Blondie first gained a following by playing regular gigs at New York's CBGBs. And over the decades, they've stuck to playing smaller venues.
I think I like sort of like somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000, you know, places. I'm used to that. That's mostly what we've been playing over the years. We've never really developed a show for big stadiums. We've never been a real stadium band, although I would like to be. I would love to have a really great, you know, big stadium show.
2 years later, she got the chance, as she and the rest of Blondie set off on a world tour to commemorate the 30th anniversary of their classic album, Parallel Lines. Back in 2003, after more than 2 decades, folk troubadours Simon and Garfunkel put aside their differences and reunited for their first US concert, performing the hits that made them folk icons in the 60s, like Mrs. Robinson, The Sound of Silence, and Homeward Bound. Boyhood friends, the two started recording together at the age of 15. Paul Simon wrote the poetic lyrics, and Art Garfunkel had the soaring voice. Together they made sweet harmonies, and eventually sold more than 40 million albums in the US. The duo broke up in 1970 upon the release of their most successful album, the appropriately titled Bridge Over Troubled Waters, and Paul went on to pursue a successful solo career. Tussles over royalties and credit for work drove the two friends further apart, but after being honoured with a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Grammys in February 2003, the idea for the Old Friends Tour was born.
Really, we are our oldest friends. We've known each other since the age of 11. And whatever it was, the squabbles as they're called, that's pretty much what it was, just squabbles. It was time to just say, forgive, forget, move on. It's not like you have forever in life. So the Grammys was our opportunity to do that.
Over 1 million fans had come out to see the duo at an earlier reunion concert in New York Central Park in 1981. But clearly they hadn't been quite ready to bury the hatchet just yet.
Remember when we came off the stage, I said, well, we didn't do our vocal thing quite like we can. I don't think it happened. And you said, you're crazy. They love the show. What do you want?
This is what he said. We walked off the stage, and I said to him, what do you think? And he said, disaster.
This time round, however, things have been going a lot smoother, with Paul and Art announcing tours of Australia, New Zealand and Japan in 2009.